largest military defeat in modern history did not happen where most people think it did. It did not unfold under the spotlights of the Western press. It was not narrated by correspondents broadcasting from liberated capitals. It happened in the forests and swamps of Belarus, across a front stretching hundreds of kilometers, in the summer of 1944, and it consumed an entire German army group in 8 weeks, while most of the world was looking somewhere else entirely. Be honest, had you ever heard of Operation Bagration before this moment? And if not, why do you think one of the most consequential events of the 20th century was allowed to slip into the margins of collective memory? Because this is not simply a story about a battle. It is a story about how wars are remembered, about which victories become legends and which ones vanish into footnotes, and about a deception so perfectly constructed that it fooled not only the German High Command in 1944, but in some ways continues to fool popular history today. To understand what happened on June 22nd, 1944, you first have to understand what the German military believed was about to happen, because the gap between their expectation and reality is where the catastrophe was born. By the spring of 1944, the German intelligence apparatus on the Eastern Front, a department known as Fremdheer Ost, Foreign Armies East, had been watching Soviet troop movements for months. They had reconnaissance aircraft photographing rail yards and staging areas. They had radio intercept teams logging the frequency and patterns of Soviet communications. They had agents behind enemy lines feeding back reports. And the picture all of these sources painted was remarkably consistent. The Soviets were massing their strength in the south, in Ukraine, where enormous armored formations were clearly visible to aerial photography. The logic seemed obvious. Ukraine offered the road to Romania, to the oil fields that kept the German war machine running, to strategic prizes that any rational adversary would want to seize. The intelligence analysts wrote their reports. The reports went up the chain, and at the very top, Adolf Hitler and his operations staff looked at the maps and agreed. The main Soviet blow would fall in the south. The forces defending Belarus, Army Group Center, with its 20 divisions, occupied what the German command designated a secondary sector. This assessment was not the product of incompetence. The intelligence officers who produced it were experienced professionals, working with the best information available to them. The problem was that every piece of information available to them had been deliberately shaped by an adversary who understood exactly how the German intelligence system processed data, and who had spent months feeding it a version of reality that was coherent, logical, and completely false. What the Soviet military accomplished in the weeks before Bagration was not simply concealment. It was the construction of an entire fictional reality designed to be discovered by German intelligence and interpreted as truth. In the south, thousands of dummy tanks and vehicles built from wood and canvas were positioned in areas that German reconnaissance aircraft would photograph. Radio units transmitted messages using the call signs and communication patterns of armored formations that had actually moved hundreds of kilometers north. Agents that Soviet counterintelligence had identified in turn were fed information confirming the presence of forces that existed only as props and radio signals. Meanwhile, in Belarus, the actual offensive force was assembling in conditions of secrecy that redefined what military deception could achieve. 2,400,000 soldiers, 5,200 tanks, more than 31,000 artillery pieces, 5,300 aircraft. All of it moved at night. Trains carrying entire divisions ran only between 10 in the evening and 4 in the morning, with cargo covered and strict radio silence enforced throughout transit. Tanks rolled from railheads to their staging positions, with engines wrapped in sound-absorbing material. Commanders were forbidden from discussing operational plans by any means other than face-to-face conversation with their immediate subordinates. Every communication channel that German intercept teams might monitor went deliberately quiet, creating the electronic signature of a sector where nothing significant was being prepared. The result was that when the German Chief of Staff presented his assessment of Soviet intentions in June 1944, he told Hitler exactly what the Soviets wanted him to believe. The main attack would come in Ukraine. Belarus was safe. The armored reserves that could have reinforced Army Group Center were held in the south. waiting for a blow that would never arrive. Here's where something deeper than tactical deception enters the picture. The German command was not simply tricked by false information. It was tricked by its own assumptions. Hitler and his strategists thought in terms of territorial objectives, of resources and geography, of the economic logic, capturing oil fields and industrial regions. The men designing Bagration, Marshal Zhukov and General Vasilevsky, were thinking in entirely different terms. They were not interested in capturing territory. They were interested in destroying forces. And Army Group Center, sitting in positions that had been designated as important the previous year, supplied and reinforced according to that designation, represented the single force whose destruction would collapse the entire German position on the Eastern Front more decisively than any territorial gain in the South. The operational concept they designed to achieve this destruction was built on a principle that Soviet military doctrine called deep operations, and its logic was elegant in its brutality. The objective was not to attack the German divisions holding the front line directly. The objective was to penetrate through the gaps between those divisions with fast-moving armored columns that would drive hundreds of kilometers into the German rear, cutting supply lines, severing communications, and closing the roads that any retreating force would need to use. The German divisions on the front line would be pinned in place by infantry and artillery attacks, while the armored spearheads completed encirclements behind them. The result would be what Soviet planners described as pockets within pockets, a layered geometry of encirclement operating at multiple scales simultaneously. At the tactical level, a German division might be fighting Soviet infantry to its front without knowing that 50 kilometers behind it, a tank column had already cut the road, carrying its ammunition supply. At the operational level, an entire corps might be organizing a withdrawal without knowing that the road it was withdrawing toward had been severed by another penetration 150 kilometers away. And at the strategic level, Army Group Center as a whole would face multiple simultaneous crises with no ability to respond to any of them because the means of response, the armored reserves, were sitting in Ukraine waiting for an attack that existed only in the imagination of German intelligence. At 5 in the morning on June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after Germany had launched its own invasion of the Soviet Union, the artillery of 4 Soviet fronts opened fire simultaneously across the entire width of Army Group Center. The bombardment lasted between 2 and 3 hours, depending on the sector. German reports from the first hours describe it not as a series of explosions, but as a single continuous sound that made it impossible to distinguish individual detonations, that shook the ground so violently that soldiers in trenches lost spatial orientation, and that after hours of sustained exposure, produced what medical officers documented with the clinical term combat fatigue, but which was in reality the temporary incapacitation of the human nervous system through sensory overload. What followed the bombardment unfolded with a speed that the German command structure could not process. In the north, the 3rd Belarusian front penetrated German defenses near Vitebsk and sent armored columns racing westward, while the 5 divisions garrisoning the city found themselves surrounded. Vitebsk had been designated a fortress city by Hitler months earlier, with orders to hold to the last man. The garrison commander requested permission to attempt to break out. Permission arrived late, partial, and burdened with restrictions that made the operation tactically more difficult than it already was. What remained of the Vitebsk garrison after the breakout attempt was a fraction of its original strength. The commanding general was captured. 5 divisions ceased to exist as functional military formations within days. Now let me ask you this. If you were a commander receiving orders to hold a position that was already surrounded, with no realistic prospect of relief, would you obey the order or act on your own judgment? Where does the line fall between discipline and self-destruction? Simultaneously, in the south of the sector, General Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front was executing a penetration aimed not at the city of Bobruisk itself, but at the bridges over the Berezina River to its west. Those bridges were the escape route. By seizing them before the German forces in Bobruisk could withdraw, Rokossovsky turned a tactical advance into an operational encirclement. His armored columns covered 50 kilometers on the first day. another 40 on the 2nd, reaching their objectives ahead of even the most optimistic Soviet planning estimates. By June 27th, 6 German divisions were completely encircled near Bobruisk. The breakout attempts that followed produced scenes that survivors described decades later with the vivid specificity of people who had experienced something for which ordinary language is insufficient. Columns of soldiers attempting to move through Belarusian swamps under continuous air attack, losing vehicles in the mud, losing unit cohesion as commanders fell and their replacements lacked the information or means to maintain tactical organization. The Soviet air superiority during Bagration was not incidental. It was the product of years of industrial output, of American aircraft delivered through Lend-Lease, and of the systematic attrition of the Luftwaffe across the Eastern Front. The Soviets operated 5,300 aircraft in the Bagration sector. The Luftwaffe could oppose perhaps 800, and those 800 were simultaneously being demanded in the West, where Normandy generated its own urgent requirements. The practical result was that any German unit attempting to move during daylight in Belarus was doing the tactical equivalent of crossing an open field under observation by an enemy who could see everything from above and had enough ammunition to keep attacking continuously. On June 28th, Hitler relieved Field Marshal Ernst Busch from command of Army Group Center and replaced him with Field Marshal Walter Model, the Wehrmacht's finest defensive specialist, a man who had stabilized collapsing fronts on multiple occasions with insufficient resources. Model arrived and found a situation that even his exceptional abilities could not resolve with the means available. Divisions that were supposed to exist according to staff maps had ceased to function as coherent units. Corps headquarters were sending messages requesting guidance from positions that Soviet columns had already surrounded or were in the process of surrounding. Reinforcement divisions arriving from the south were committed piecemeal to the most critical sectors before they could organize into formations large enough to produce a meaningful operational effect. Each division was absorbed by the local crisis before the next echelon of reinforcements became available. The speed of the Soviet advance consistently outpaced the speed of German reserve concentration. By July 3rd, the Red Army had captured Minsk, the capital of Belarus and Army Group Center's most important logistical hub. The fall of Minsk completed the largest encirclement of the entire operation. Approximately 100,000 German soldiers were trapped east of the city, cut off from supply, from communication, and from any realistic hope of relief. What happened to those 100,000 men over the following days and weeks followed the pattern that encirclements on the Eastern Front invariably produced when the scale was this large and the conditions this desperate. Those who attempted to break through the Soviet perimeter died in the attempt or were captured shortly afterward. Those who chose not to attempt it surrendered in groups as supplies ran out, and continued resistance ceased to be a physical possibility. The Belarusian swamps, which under other circumstances would have been merely difficult terrain, became the defining element for many units. The only direction where the Soviet perimeter was less dense often led deeper into marshland where vehicles were useless. Movement on foot was exhausting, and navigation without maps or landmarks was nearly impossible. One German regimental commander, captured on July 8th, described his final days of freedom in terms stripped of any pretense. He had stopped knowing exactly where his unit was on the 5th day. His maps no longer corresponded to the terrain he could see. He and his officers navigated by the position of the sun during the day and the stars at night. They lost more men to the swamps than to direct enemy fire. The enemy, he said, was not the primary problem. The primary problem was that they no longer knew where they were and could not communicate with anyone who did. That description captures something essential about the nature of Army Group Centers. Collapse that operational analyses often express in terms of force ratios and tactical advantages, but that carried a more immediate and more disturbing dimension for the men who lived through it. It was the loss of the ability to comprehend what was happening in real time. A force that cannot understand its situation cannot act upon it, and a force that cannot act upon its situation simply absorbs blows without any possibility of influencing the course of events. On July 17, 1944, Something occurred in the streets of Moscow that had no precedent in the city's history, and perhaps no precedent in the history of any European capital in the 20th century. A column of 57,000 German prisoners of war captured during the first weeks of Bagration was marched through the center of Moscow. The generals walked at the front of the column. Behind them, in reverse order of military hierarchy, came senior officers, then junior officers, then non-commissioned officers, and finally enlisted soldiers. They wore the uniforms in which they had been captured, some more deteriorated than others, depending on how long they had spent in the swamps or the encirclements before surrendering. They walked in the heat of a Moscow July, through a city that 3 years earlier had seen these same forces reach its outskirts before the December 1941 counteroffensive stopped them. The people of Moscow who watched the column pass had lost family members in the war at a frequency Soviet casualty statistics make difficult to overstate. What they were seeing on July 17th was the material demonstration of something that victory communiques could announce, but that no announcement could make as concrete and as physically present as 57,000 men walking through their streets. The sound of the column was the sound of boots on pavement, the footsteps of 57,000 people moving through a silence that the crowd maintained along most of the route. There were no major incidents. There were no attacks on the prisoners. There was, according to the testimony of Muscovites who were present, a mixture of emotions that simple words like triumph or vengeance do not adequately capture. There was satisfaction. There was exhaustion. There was the awareness that the war was not over, even though this procession was a signal that its outcome was no longer uncertain in the way it had been during the worst months of 1941 and 1942. Behind the column of prisoners, a fleet of water trucks drove along the streets the Germans had crossed, washing the pavement. That image, which Soviet propaganda did not need to invent because it was real and documented, communicated something about the meaning the Soviet regime intended the march to carry. The passage of those men through the streets of Moscow was a contamination that had to be cleansed. The city was to be washed clean of their trace, just as the nation intended to be washed clean of the invasion those men represented. Operation Bagration concluded formally on August 19, 1944. In 8 weeks, it had advanced between 500 and 600 kilometers at its deepest points. It had destroyed or crippled 28 German divisions. It had captured their generals. It had eliminated Army Group Center as an operational force. Soviet losses were also enormous, as they always were on the Eastern Front. But the fundamental difference was that the Red Army could absorb those losses and continue advancing, while the German Army, in the summer of 1944, could not replace what it had lost in Belarus with anything approaching the speed necessary to rebuild a coherent front before the Soviet momentum carried into new sectors. To place this in the context that June and July of 1944 make possible, during the same period that Bagration was destroying Army Group Center, the Normandy campaign had advanced approximately 30 kilometers from the invasion beaches. German casualties on the Western Front during those weeks were real and significant, but they were a fraction of what the Eastern Front was consuming in the same window of time. Army Group Center lost more men in 30 days than the German Army lost on the entire Western Front during the Normandy campaign through the liberation of Paris. This comparison does not diminish what happened in Normandy. It simply establishes the actual scale of what happened in Belarus, a scale that the Western world's focus on the theater most immediately relevant to its own experience has tended to obscure ever since. What Bagration did to the Second World War was not to end it. That would require 10 more months of fighting. What it did was establish, in terms that every subsequent event would confirm without altering, that the outcome was already determined. Army Group Center had been the spine of the German position on the Eastern Front, the force holding the most direct axis between Moscow and Berlin, the massive divisions that made it possible for Germany to maintain a continuous front from the Arctic to the Black Sea. Its destruction in 8 weeks created a military reality that no subsequent operation on either front could change in its fundamentals. The greatest defeat in the history of the German army was not Stalingrad, where one army was destroyed in an encirclement that lasted months and that the world followed in real time. It was Bagration, where an entire army group was annihilated in 8 weeks in an operation the Western world was barely watching because it had its own maps to follow, its own beaches to track, its own liberation narratives to construct. The difference between these two defeats is not simply one of scale. It is one of historical visibility, and that difference in visibility is itself part of the story of how the 20th century chose to remember the war that defined it. The battles that shape the future are not always the ones that make the front page. Sometimes the most consequential events unfold in the places nobody is looking, in the silence between the headlines, in the margins where history happens while the cameras point elsewhere. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thought of all. Not that we missed it then, but that we're still missing it now. Some of you are already subscribed. Thank you, genuinely. If you are not yet, this is your sign. Join us. There's much more coming.